A group poses for photo at July 4th Fair 1909, but when enlarged, an impossible face appears in the crowd. What happens when a simple celebration photo becomes one of the most disturbing photographic mysteries in American history? Today, we're diving into a 1909 Independence Day photograph that has puzzled experts for over a century. What started as a joyful group portrait at a 4th of July fair turned into an investigation that challenges our understanding of early photography and perhaps reality itself. If you're already enjoying this type of content, don't forget to hit that like button to support the channel. And before we begin, I want to mention that I'm also developing another channel focused on unexplained historical mysteries. So if you love these deep dives into the unknown, you'll definitely want to check that out too. The autumn of 2019 brought with it an estate sale that would forever change how we look at historical photography. The Morrison family of Riverside, Iowa, was preparing to sell their century-old farmhouse when they discovered a collection of photographs tucked away in the cellar's stone walls. Among the water-damaged albums and loose prints was a single photograph that would soon capture the attention of historians, photography experts, and mystery enthusiasts around the world. The photograph measured approximately 8 x 10 inches and was mounted on the thick cardboard backing typical of professional photography from the early 1900s. The image showed a group of about 12 people posed in front of what appeared to be a carnival or fair setting. Bunting hung from wooden posts, and in the background the shadowy outlines of carnival tents and booths were visible. The people in the photograph were dressed in their finest 4th of July attire, the men in formal suits despite the summer heat, the women in long white dresses with elaborate hats adorned with patriotic ribbons. At first glance, it was exactly what you'd expect from a 1909 Independence Day celebration. The group appeared to be a mix of families and friends, ranging in age from young children to elderly grandparents. Their poses were formal but cheerful, with several people sporting genuine smiles, unusual for photography of that era, when long exposure times typically required subjects to maintain serious expressions. The photographer's stamp on the bottom right corner identified the image as the work of Westfield Photography Studios, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, July 4th, 1909. The handwritten notation on the back, in faded brown ink, simply read, "Riverside Fair, Independence Day Celebration, the Henderson and Millwright families." Sarah Morrison, the great-granddaughter of the original homeowners, initially saw nothing unusual about the photograph. Her family had lived in the area for generations, and she recognized it as a typical example of early 20th century community celebration photography. However, her teenage son Jake, who had developed an interest in digital photography and photo enhancement, asked if he could scan the image to practice his restoration skills. Using his computer and photo editing software, Jake began the process of digitally cleaning and enhancing the old photograph. He worked methodically, removing dust spots, adjusting contrast, and sharpening details that had become blurred with age. As he increased the resolution and began to examine different sections of the image more closely, he noticed something that made him call for his mother immediately. "Mom, you need to look at this," Jake said, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "There's something weird about this picture." Sarah approached her son's computer screen, expecting to see some minor flaw or artifact from the scanning process. Instead, she found herself staring at something that defied immediate explanation. Jake had enlarged a section of the photograph that showed the crowd of fairgoers in the background, behind the main group posing for the camera. Among the blurred figures of people enjoying the fair, children with balloons, couples walking arm in arm, vendors at their booths, was a face that seemed completely out of place. The face appeared to be staring directly at the camera with an intensity that was disturbing in its focus and clarity. Unlike the other background figures, who were caught in natural poses and movements, this particular face seemed frozen in an expression of deliberate attention. What made the face truly unsettling was its apparent disconnection from any visible body. While other people in the background could be seen in full or partial form, heads connected to shoulders, bodies in logical proportion, this particular face seemed to hover at an impossible height and angle, as if it were floating independently among the crowd. Sarah's initial reaction was skepticism. "It's probably just a trick of light and shadow," she told Jake. "Or maybe someone was standing on something and the body is just obscured by other people." But as they continued to examine the enhanced image, both mother and son found themselves increasingly uncomfortable with what they were seeing. The face was remarkably clear and detailed despite being part of the background crowd. The eyes seemed to be looking directly at the photographer with an expression that was difficult to interpret, not quite hostile, but certainly intense and focused in a way that suggested deliberate positioning. Jake adjusted the contrast and brightness of that specific section of the photograph, trying to reveal more details about the surrounding area. Instead of clarifying the mystery, the enhanced view only made it more puzzling. The face appeared to be suspended in a way that defied the normal rules of perspective and physical possibility. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself returning to look at the photograph repeatedly. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about the image was fundamentally wrong, though she couldn't articulate exactly what that feeling was based on. The face in the crowd seemed to be watching her, following her movements around the room in the way that eyes in portraits sometimes appear to do. Curious about the photograph's history and hoping to find some logical explanation for the anomalous face, Sarah decided to research the Henderson and Millwright families mentioned in the handwritten notation. She visited the Riverside Historical Society and began searching through genealogical records, newspaper archives, and other documentation from the early 1900s. The Historical Society's records confirmed that both the Henderson and Millwright families had been prominent members of the Riverside community during the first decade of the 20th century. John Henderson had owned a successful grain elevator business, while Robert Millwright had operated the town's largest general store. Both families were known for their community involvement and were regular participants in local celebrations and events. However, Sarah's research also uncovered something unexpected. According to the Cedar Rapids Gazette's coverage of the 1909 4th of July celebration, there had been an incident at the Riverside Fair that year. The brief newspaper article dated July 6, 1909, mentioned that the festivities had been marred by the unexplained disappearance of a local resident during the evening's activities. The article provided few details about the disappearance, noting only that Mr. Thomas Whitmore, age 34, was reported missing by his wife after failing to return home from the Independence Day celebration. Local authorities are investigating the matter. This discovery added a new dimension to the mystery of the photograph. Sarah began to wonder whether the strange face in the crowd might somehow be connected to the disappearance mentioned in the newspaper. Was it possible that Thomas Whitmore had been captured in this photograph just before or during whatever circumstances led to his disappearance? Sarah's discovery of the newspaper article about Thomas Whitmore's disappearance prompted her to contact Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a professor of American history at the University of Iowa who specialized in early 20th century Midwestern communities. Dr. I. Hartwell had developed a reputation for her meticulous research methods and her willingness to investigate historical mysteries that other academics might dismiss as trivial. When Sarah showed Dr. Hartwell the enhanced photograph and explained the connection to the Whitmore disappearance, the professor's interest was immediately piqued. This is exactly the kind of case that can teach us so much about both historical documentation and the limitations of our investigative methods, Dr. Hartwell explained during their first meeting at the university. Dr. Hartwell's initial examination of the photograph focused on its authenticity and technical characteristics. She confirmed that the paper stock, mounting techniques, and photographic processes were consistent with professional portrait work from the 1908-1912 period. The Westfield Photography Studio stamp was legitimate. The business had operated in Cedar Rapids from 1904 to 1918, when the owner retired and moved to California. More importantly, Dr. Hartwell was able to locate the original glass plate negative for the photograph in the archives of the Cedar Rapids Historical Museum. The Westfield Studios collection had been donated to the museum in 1967, and it included hundreds of glass plates from community events, family portraits, and commercial photography work. The existence of the original glass plate negative was crucial because it eliminated the possibility that the anomalous face had been added to the photograph through modern digital manipulation. Whatever was visible in Sarah's enhanced image had been present in the original photographic capture from 1909. Dr. Hartwell arranged to have the glass plate examined by Dr. Marcus Chen, a forensic photography specialist who worked with law enforcement agencies on image authentication and analysis. Dr. Chen brought sophisticated equipment to examine the original negative under various lighting conditions and magnification levels. His findings were both confirming and puzzling. The image on this glass plate negative is consistent with a single exposure taken under normal photographic conditions, Dr. Chen reported. There's no evidence of double exposure, composite imaging, or any of the manipulation techniques that were available to photographers in 1909. However, the spatial relationships in the background crowd area are unusual. Dr. Chen's technical analysis revealed that the mysterious face appeared to be positioned at a height and angle that didn't correspond logically with the perspective lines established by other elements in the photograph. While the main group of subjects and most of the background figures followed predictable rules of perspective and depth, the anomalous face seemed to exist in a different spatial plane. It's as if this particular element of the photograph is following different optical rules than everything around it, Dr. Chen explained. I've never seen anything quite like it in historical photography. Meanwhile, Dr. Hartwell continued her research into the Whitmore disappearance and its potential connection to the photograph. She discovered that Thomas Whitmore had indeed been present at the 4th of July celebration, according to multiple witness accounts recorded by local authorities. He had been seen throughout the day at various booths and events at the fair, and several people remembered seeing him during the early evening hours. However, the circumstances of his disappearance remained mysterious. Whitmore's wife, Mary, had told authorities that her husband had planned to meet friends for a group photograph sometime during the late afternoon. After that, he simply vanished. No one could recall seeing him leave the fairgrounds, and despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, no trace of him was ever found. The local newspaper's coverage of the disappearance had been limited, but Dr. Hartwell was able to locate more detailed information in the Cedar Rapids Police Department's archived records. The investigation file, preserved in the basement of the county courthouse, contained witness statements that provided a more complete picture of Whitmore's final known activities. According to these statements, Whitmore had been in good spirits throughout the day. He had participated in various fair activities, purchased items from several vendors, and spent time talking with friends and neighbors. There were no reports of arguments, conflicts, or any behavior that might have suggested he was planning to disappear voluntarily. Most intriguingly, several witnesses mentioned that Whitmore had been particularly interested in having his photograph taken. One witness, a neighbor named Mrs. Ruth Patterson, stated that Whitmore had approached her during the afternoon to ask about the group photograph that was being organized by the Henderson and Millwright families. He seemed quite eager to be included in the photograph, Mrs. Patterson had told investigators. He said something about wanting to be remembered as part of the community celebration. I thought it was a bit odd at the time because Thomas wasn't usually one to seek attention or want to be in pictures. This statement raised new questions about Whitmore's possible presence in the photograph. If he had been interested in participating in the group portrait, was it possible that the anomalous face belonged to him? And if so, why did his image appear in such an unusual and disturbing manner? Dr. Hartwell attempted to locate photographs of Thomas Whitmore to compare with the mysterious face in the crowd. Unfortunately, personal photography was less common in 1909, and most families could afford professional portraits only for special occasions. The Whitmore family had apparently never commissioned a formal portrait, and no surviving family members had any photographs of Thomas. The investigation took another interesting turn when Dr. Hartwell discovered that the Westfield Photography Studios had maintained detailed appointment books and client records. The studio's records for July 4, 1909 showed that the Henderson and Millwright family group portrait had been scheduled for 4:30 p.m. However, there was an additional notation that caught Dr. Hartwell's attention. In the margin next to the appointment, someone had written in pencil, "Extra individual requested, TW, special arrangement. See supplementary notes." Unfortunately, the supplementary notes referenced in this margin notation had not survived in the archive. If you're finding this investigation as intriguing as we are, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue these deep dives into historical mysteries. The discovery of the notation about TW and a special arrangement in the photography studio's records prompted Dr. Hartwell to expand her investigation beyond the photograph itself. She reached out to genealogical researchers and local history enthusiasts throughout Iowa, hoping to uncover more information about Thomas Whitmore and the circumstances surrounding the 1909 Independence Day celebration. Her efforts paid off when she was contacted by Margaret Kowalski, a retired librarian from Davenport who had spent decades researching Iowa family histories. Margaret had been following Dr. Hartwell's investigation through local historical society newsletters and believed she might have relevant information about the Whitmore family. "I've been working on a comprehensive genealogical database for Johnson County families," Margaret explained during their phone conversation. "The Whitmore name caught my attention because I'd encountered some unusual records related to that family line while researching cemetery records and obituaries from the early 1900s. Margaret's research had uncovered something peculiar about Thomas Whitmore's background. According to county records, Thomas had arrived in Riverside in 1905, claiming to be from Pennsylvania. However, when Margaret attempted to trace his family history back to Pennsylvania, she encountered inconsistencies and dead ends that suggested his background story might not have been entirely truthful. The strange thing is that there's no record of a Thomas Whitmore matching his age and description in any of the Pennsylvania counties he claimed to be from, Margaret reported. It's as if he simply appeared in Riverside in 1905 with no verifiable past. This revelation added another layer of mystery to the case. Why would someone create a false identity in a small Iowa town? And could this deception somehow be connected to his mysterious disappearance 4 years later? Dr. Hartwell decided to examine the original glass plate negative more thoroughly, hoping to uncover additional details that might have been missed in previous examinations. She arranged to borrow specialized photographic equipment from the university's art department and spent several days creating high-resolution scans and enhanced images of different sections of the photograph. Her meticulous examination revealed several previously unnoticed details. In addition to the anomalous face that had originally attracted attention, there were subtle inconsistencies in the background crowd that became apparent only under extreme magnification. Some figures appeared slightly out of focus compared to others at the same apparent distance from the camera. Shadows fell in directions that didn't quite match the established light source for the main group of subjects. Most disturbing was her discovery of what appeared to be a second unusual face in the far background of the photograph. This face was much more subtly anomalous than the first. It required significant enhancement to become clearly visible, but it shared the same unsettling quality of appearing to stare directly at the camera while being spatially disconnected from any visible body. Dr. Chen, the forensic photography specialist, was called in to examine these new findings. His analysis confirmed that the second anomalous face was indeed present in the original glass plate negative and had not been introduced through digital enhancement. However, he was unable to provide a technical explanation for how such images could have been captured using 1909 photography equipment and techniques. From a purely technical standpoint, what we're seeing should be impossible, Dr. Chen admitted. The spatial distortions, the inconsistent focus, the directional lighting, none of it follows the optical laws that govern photography. Yet here it is, clearly documented in an authenticated historical negative. The investigation took another unexpected turn when Sarah Morrison received a call from an elderly man named Frank Hutchins, who lived in a nursing home in Cedar Rapids. Frank had seen a newspaper article about the mysterious photograph and believed he might have information relevant to the case. Frank, who was 94 years old, claimed to be the grandson of Harold Hutchins, who had worked as an assistant to the photographer at Westfield Studios during the summer of 1909. According to Frank, his grandfather had often talked about unusual events that occurred during that particular 4th of July photo session. "My grandfather used to tell stories about that day," Frank said during his interview with Dr. Hartwell. "He said there was something wrong with the photograph, something that bothered the photographer so much that he almost refused to develop it. But the families had paid for it, so he went ahead with the processing." Frank's grandfather had apparently described seeing extra faces in the developed photograph that didn't correspond to any of the people who had been present during the actual photo session. Harold Hutchins had been convinced that something supernatural had interfered with the photographic process, though he couldn't explain what or why. More intriguingly, Frank recalled his grandfather mentioning that the photographer had taken a second photograph of the same group immediately after the first one, hoping to capture a normal image. However, this second photograph had supposedly been even more disturbing than the first, showing additional anomalous faces and what Harold had described as impossible shadows. Dr. Hartwell immediately searched the Westfield Studios archives for any evidence of a second photograph from that session. Unfortunately, if such a photograph had ever existed, it was no longer in the collection. The glass plate negative database showed only one entry for the Henderson and Millwright family group portrait on July 4th, 1909. The mystery deepened when Dr. Hartwell discovered a brief mention of the Whitmore disappearance in a spiritualist newsletter published in Cedar Rapids in 1910. The article, titled "Unexplained Vanishing Points to Spirit World Intervention," claimed that Thomas Whitmore had been called to the other side during a moment when the veil between worlds was temporarily lifted. While Dr. Hartwell was skeptical of supernatural explanations, the article provided additional context about how the disappearance had been perceived by some members of the community. It also suggested that there had been other unusual occurrences during the 1909 4th of July celebration that hadn't been reported in the mainstream newspapers. The spiritualist newsletter mentioned strange disturbances during the evening hours of the celebration, including reports of people seeing familiar faces in impossible locations and hearing voices of individuals who weren't physically present. While these accounts could easily be dismissed as folklore or hysteria, they created a pattern of anomalous experiences associated with that particular event. Leave a comment and let me know what you think about these new discoveries. Are we getting closer to understanding this mystery, or are we just uncovering more questions? As Dr. Hartwell's investigation progressed, the case attracted attention from various experts and enthusiasts, each bringing their own perspective to the mysterious photograph. The combination of historical intrigue, technical anomalies, and supernatural speculation had created a perfect storm of interest among different communities of researchers. Dr. Robert Morrison, a psychology professor at Northwestern University who specialized in perception and cognition, became interested in the case from a completely different angle. He proposed that the anomalous faces might be examples of pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon where the human brain interprets random or vague visual stimuli as familiar objects, particularly faces. Historical photographs often contain artifacts, shadows, and chemical irregularities that can create patterns the brain interprets as faces, Dr. Morrison explained. When we're primed to look for something mysterious, our pattern recognition systems can become hyperactive, creating the perception of meaningful images where none actually exist. To test this theory, Dr. Morrison conducted an experiment with university students, showing them various sections of the photograph without explaining what they were supposed to be looking for. Surprisingly, nearly 70% of the participants identified at least one face in the background crowd areas, though they didn't always identify the same faces that had been noted by previous researchers. However, Dr. Morrison's pareidolia theory was challenged by the forensic photography analysis. Dr. Chen pointed out that the anomalous faces showed consistent structural details across multiple examination methods and lighting conditions. These aren't random patterns being interpreted as faces, he argued. These are coherent visual elements with consistent proportions, shadows, and details that remain stable under different analytical approaches. Meanwhile, Professor Janet Walsh from the University of Chicago's History of Science Department offered a different theoretical framework. She suggested that the anomalies might be explained by experimental photographic techniques that were being developed in 1909 but weren't widely known or documented. The early 1900s were a period of rapid innovation in photography, Professor Walsh noted. There were numerous experimental techniques being developed by individual photographers, many of which were never formally documented or published. It's possible that the photographer at Westfield Studios was experimenting with some form of composite imaging or multiple exposure technique that created these unusual effects. Professor Walsh's research revealed that several photographers during this period had been experimenting with spirit photography techniques, deliberately creating images that appeared to show supernatural phenomena. These techniques involved various forms of image manipulation, including the use of prepared glass plates, reflective surfaces, and carefully positioned mirrors to create the appearance of ghostly figures in photographs. However, this explanation raised its own questions. If the Westfield photographer had been intentionally creating supernatural effects, why hadn't he advertised this service? And why would he have applied such techniques to what was supposed to be a straightforward community group portrait? The investigation took yet another direction when Dr. Amanda Foster, a cultural anthropologist from the Smithsonian Institution, suggested that the case might be better understood within the context of early 20th century American folklore and belief systems. Dr. Foster's research revealed that the summer of 1909 had been marked by unusual cultural tensions throughout the Midwest. There had been reports of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and supernatural sightings in numerous small towns across Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Some historians had attributed these reports to social anxiety related to rapid industrialization and changing community structures. Small rural communities were experiencing unprecedented change during this period, Dr. Foster explained. Traditional ways of life were being disrupted by new technologies, economic pressures, and social mobility. In such environments, folklore and supernatural beliefs often served as ways for communities to process and understand changes that they couldn't rationally explain. According to Dr. Foster's research, Thomas Whitmore's mysterious background and sudden disappearance might have made him a focal point for community anxieties about strangers and social change. The anomalous appearance of faces in the community photograph could be interpreted as a symbolic representation of these social tensions rather than a literal supernatural phenomenon. However, this anthropological interpretation still didn't explain the technical aspects of how the unusual images had appeared in the photograph. Dr. Foster acknowledged that her theoretical framework could coexist with other explanations, but couldn't account for the specific visual anomalies documented in the glass plate negative. As different experts proposed their theories, new evidence continued to emerge. Sarah Morrison discovered additional photographs in her family's collection that showed other community events from the 1905 to 1915 period. Several of these photographs, when examined under high magnification, showed similar but less dramatic anomalies. Faces that appeared slightly out of place or perspective, shadows that didn't quite follow the established lighting patterns. This discovery suggested that whatever had caused the anomalies in the 4th of July photograph might not have been a unique occurrence. Dr. Hartwell began to wonder whether there had been something unusual about photographic conditions in Riverside during that particular period, or whether multiple photographs from different events might be connected in some way. The case became even more complex when Frank Hutchins, the elderly man who had provided information about his grandfather's experiences at Westfield Studios, mentioned that his family had preserved some of his grandfather's personal belongings, including what appeared to be photographic equipment and notes. Frank's nephew arranged for these materials to be examined by the research team. Among the items was a small leather notebook that contained Harold Hutchins' observations about various photography sessions between 1908 and 1912. The entries were brief and often cryptic, but several references caught the researchers' attention. One entry, dated July 10, 1909, read, "The Independence Day portraits came out wrong again. Same problem as the church social and the harvest festival. Mr. Westfield won't talk about it, but I know he sees them too. The faces that shouldn't be there." Another entry from August 1909 noted, "Tried to photograph the Thompson wedding. 3 extra figures appeared in the family group. Bride's mother became hysterical when she saw the developed plates. Mr. Westfield destroyed the negatives and refunded their money." These notebook entries suggested that the anomalous faces in photographs might have been a recurring problem for Westfield Studios during 1909, rather than an isolated incident associated with the 4th of July celebration. If you're as fascinated by these conflicting theories as we are, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. We're getting deeper into this mystery, and your support helps us continue this investigation. Despite months of intensive investigation involving historians, forensic experts, psychologists, and anthropologists, the mystery of the 4th of July photograph remained unsolved. Each potential explanation seemed to answer some questions while raising others, and no single theory could account for all the documented anomalies and circumstances surrounding the case. Dr. Hartwell's final report, published in the Journal of Historical Photography, summarized the various findings and theories without reaching a definitive conclusion. This case demonstrates the limitations of our investigative methods when confronted with historical anomalies that don't fit established patterns, she wrote. Sometimes the most honest response to a mystery is to acknowledge that we simply don't have enough information to solve it definitively. The technical analysis had established several facts beyond reasonable doubt. The photograph was authentic, dating from 1909, and had not been subjected to modern digital manipulation. The anomalous faces were present in the original glass plate negative and showed consistent details under various forms of examination. The spatial relationships and lighting patterns in the photograph contained elements that didn't follow normal optical laws. However, explaining how these anomalies had occurred remained elusive. Dr. Chen's forensic analysis had ruled out most known photographic techniques from the 1909 era, while Dr. Morrison's psychological experiments had demonstrated that the anomalies weren't simply products of pareidolia or observer bias. The historical investigation had revealed that Thomas Whitmore's identity and background contained significant mysteries, and that his disappearance might have been connected to the photograph in ways that couldn't be fully understood. Harold Hutchins' notebook entries suggested that similar anomalies had occurred in other photographs taken during the same period, but most of those negatives had apparently been destroyed or lost. Perhaps most frustratingly, every attempt to locate additional evidence had led to more questions rather than answers. When researchers tried to trace the Henderson and Millwright family descendants, they discovered that both families had left Riverside shortly after 1909, and their current whereabouts were unknown. The Westfield Studios business records contained gaps and inconsistencies that made it difficult to reconstruct exactly what had happened during that particular period. Sarah Morrison found herself in a unique position as the owner of what might be one of the most mysterious photographs in American history. Art museums and private collectors had expressed interest in acquiring the image, while paranormal investigators and documentary filmmakers sought permission to feature it in their projects. "I've gone back and forth about what to do with this photograph," Sarah admitted during a follow-up interview. "Part of me wants to lock it away and forget about the whole thing. But another part of me feels like there's something important here that we're supposed to understand, even if we can't figure out what it is." The photograph had affected everyone who became closely involved with its investigation. Dr. Hartwell reported experiencing unusual dreams about crowds of people and faces that seemed familiar but couldn't be identified. Dr. Chen mentioned feeling uncomfortable when developing or printing other historical photographs, as if he were expecting to discover similar anomalies. Even Margaret Kowalski, the genealogical researcher, found herself questioning the reliability of historical documents in ways she never had before. Jake Morrison, who had first discovered the anomalies through digital enhancement, decided to pursue a career in forensic photography, partly as a result of his experience with the case. "This photograph taught me that there are things in the world that can't be easily explained or categorized," he said. "That doesn't make them any less real or important." The case attracted international attention when it was featured in a documentary about unexplained historical photographs. Viewers from around the world contacted the filmmakers with stories of similar experiences: family photographs that contained unexplained figures, historical images that seemed to show impossible details, community portraits that made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. Some viewers claimed to recognize the anomalous faces in the Riverside photograph, insisting that they resembled deceased relatives or people from their own family histories. However, none of these identifications could be verified through genealogical research or historical documentation. The accumulation of similar reports from other locations and time periods suggested that the Riverside photograph might not be unique. Dr. Foster, the cultural anthropologist, began collecting and studying these reports as part of a broader research project on unexplained phenomena in historical documentation. What we're seeing with this photograph and similar cases might represent a category of historical evidence that doesn't fit our current frameworks for understanding the past, Dr. Foster theorized. Perhaps our investigative methods and theoretical models need to be expanded to accommodate anomalies that don't conform to conventional explanations. The mystery deepened when additional photographs from the Westfield Studios collection were re-examined using the same high-resolution scanning and enhancement techniques that had revealed the anomalies in the 4th of July image. Several other community event photographs from the 1908-1911 period showed similar but more subtle irregularities. Faces that appeared slightly wrong, shadows that fell in impossible directions, figures that seemed to occupy spaces where no one should have been standing. These discoveries suggested that whatever had been happening in Riverside during that period might have been more widespread and systematic than initially thought. However, they also made the mystery more complex and harder to solve. If multiple photographs contained similar anomalies, it became less likely that any single event or circumstance could explain them all. As the investigation reached its first anniversary, the researchers involved had to acknowledge that they might never find a complete explanation for the phenomena documented in the photograph. The evidence was extensive and well documented, but it pointed in multiple directions without converging on a single, satisfactory conclusion. The case remained open, with various experts continuing to study different aspects of the evidence. New technologies and analytical techniques might eventually provide insights that current methods couldn't reveal, or the mystery might remain unsolved indefinitely, serving as a reminder that some aspects of historical experience might be beyond our current ability to understand. The original photograph returned to Sarah Morrison's possession, where it occupied a place of honor and unease in her family's collection. Visitors to her home often found themselves drawn to examine the image closely, and many reported feeling the same uncomfortable sensation that the anomalous faces were somehow aware of being observed. The mystery of the 1909 4th of July photograph continues to challenge our understanding of historical documentation and the limits of photographic analysis. Despite extensive investigation by multiple experts, we're left with more questions than answers. Were the anomalous faces simply tricks of light and chemistry, psychological artifacts of our pattern-seeking minds, or something more mysterious altogether? If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of photography's most perplexing mysteries, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What's your theory about those impossible faces in the crowd? Do you think we're missing something obvious? Or is this truly unexplainable? Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Which aspect of this investigation intrigued you most? The forensic analysis, the historical research, or the psychological theories? Your comments help shape future episodes, so don't be shy about sharing your thoughts. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our future explorations into history's unsolved mysteries. There are so many more puzzling photographs and unexplained historical events waiting to be investigated.